So what we will walk through is what are the main pillars that we need to look at within your business, and we'll walk through that. And what I have to say is that this is not a lecture, so prepared to get your hands dirty. This is a diagnostic, and we will use the principles, the methodology, and the logic that I use within the business. But obviously, it'll all be crammed into 45 minutes, so we will move. But I would ask for your participation. What you put in, you will get out. Okay. So what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at the gaps that may potentially exist within your business across a number of pillars. We're going to maybe question and look at what those gaps are costing you, and we're going to look at what the prioritization of that should be for you. This is not a sales pitch. My only promise to you is that at the end, the one question I'm going to have for you is if you want to have a further one-to-one conversation with myself for 30 minutes. That's the only ask. And you may decide you want to do that, and you may decide not. So, as I said, this is a working session. So what I would ask you to do, if you could get it, is just to have a piece of paper and a pen to hand so that you can draw. I hope the art levels in the class is all very, very good. We're going to be doing a little bit of our artistic element as we move through this, okay? Now, before we get into that, a little bit about businesses and small businesses within the island of Ireland. And this is referring to within the island of Ireland. I grew up in a family business. My father had 5 of them. So as a child, I know very well the challenges and the tribulations that happen within a family business. And it was actually very surprising to me, which is why I use this slide within my conversations. The statistics in relation to family businesses in particular. Now, this process that we're going to talk about is not obviously bespoke to family businesses. It works in any business. And I currently do use it within any business, and we can talk about that. But if we home in here just on the family business side of it for now, only 12% of family businesses make it to the 3rd generation. So 1 in 8. And the challenge and the struggle that brings about is that quite often when I go into businesses, the business owners within there haven't been anywhere else. They haven't seen any other business. They have put their heart and soul into this business, and too often the business owners look at me and they know that it's not right, and they know that it needs to be fixed, whatever it is, and we're going to talk about it as we move through, but they just don't know how to. And that's where the work that we do comes into play. And we go in and we partner with these businesses to help them. And the challenges that we see within these businesses are that they're just completely overwhelmed. It more likely than not is that the business has grown with them, so therefore it's very dependent on them. And what we want to try and do is to keep all of the good elements of what that owner knows, his experience or her experience of that business, whilst also training and teaching the business and the other people in the business to help grow it as well. So a question for everybody. We talked about the 3rd generation at 12%. Any guesses as to what percentage make it to the 4th generation? 4, Natalie?
5.
Yeah, Natalie's right. She wins the prize. Not that I have a prize ready, Natalie, so apologies. 4%. So 4th generation make it 4%. So it is something that I personally want to try and improve. It's something that we can improve with the skill set and knowledge that we have between myself and my team. When we go into a business, and I'm sure you've seen this yourself, we confuse hard work with efficiency. We confuse hard work with effectiveness. And that's not the case. Too often I see people who feel that if they've done a 16-hour day, they feel that they've had a really good day. Whereas actually I've always said I would prefer that somebody does a 5-hour day or a 6-hour day and works very effectively in what they're trying to deliver. And too often hard work is what then brings misalignment. It brings noise, it brings frustration, it brings all of the negative elements that we can see and feel within business. It's all of those things when our partners, or we come home from work, or we're driving home from work, or we're sitting at the dinner table in the evening. It's those conversations that we have about what didn't go right. And it's about trying to flip that and bring a fluidness and efficiency to what we do. So it's not about working harder, it's about working clever. So within organizations, there are a number of things that we see. There are obviously some elements that fall out of this, but this would be, in the main, what we see whenever we go into businesses and we begin working with them. So the first one, let's look at the first challenge that we have in a business. It could be firefighting. No plan. We don't have any real guide, no real ambition outside of what has to be done today or maybe this week. But we don't think about 6 months out. We don't think about 12 months out. And so the time and the effort, if you can imagine what we talked about in the last slide, all of that hard work combined with the firefighting element of what goes on, which in turn leads to the frustration. We've then got accountability and ownership gaps as another clear issue of what we see within businesses. And I honestly have a statement that I say, and I always say it, and I truly believe it. 99% of people that come into work genuinely want to do a good day's work. So the lack of progress, the lack of underperformance, it's not because it's malicious, it's just misaligned. People are working hard because they believe what they're working on is truly adding value. And so therefore, this is about an alignment issue as well as an accountability issue that we need to look at. For some reason, oh, we go. Then, operational bottlenecks. Again, when we talk about operational bottlenecks, we're not just talking about a production line. We can be, but we can also be talking about an invoicing process within a business. We can be talking about an estimating function handing over to a QS function, handing over to a build function. It can be any process that the business that you're operating in is. It can be anything that the process that your business is undertaking. And again, this is something I see time and time again. Where are the processes inefficient? Where are the processes not utilizing the systems that the business already has, they've bought? And where are they not using them to their full extent before we even start trying to think about adding in more? Mm-hmm. Owner dependency. Too often we have, where we talked about at the outset, where a business relies too much on the owner for all of the answers. It could be like the revolving doors that we see going into hotels, nearly one of those on their office door, because every question, every thought, every process has to go through them. And that's the bit that we need to change and unlock. And finally, the financial numbers of the business. We see too often where businesses, again, are working very, very hard. We'll talk about some case studies later on where I've been in businesses where turnover actually has been growing very, very positively, probably 20% plus growth year on year. Profitability has been going the opposite direction. And so therefore, it's about actually being financially in control of the business, having the right performance metrics. We hear an awful lot about KPIs, key performance indicators. We hear things about health metrics. We hear things about performance metrics. In the work that we're going to do, I'm going to call these performance metrics because they're more than just the margin. They're more than just the profit. There are lots of metrics within the business that will indicate the performance. And it's about actually having enough of those, but not too many. So, what is the Elevar ecosystem? Well, this beautiful image that you can see on the left-hand side, which is purposely crafted to look a little bit like a jigsaw, is done so purposely because all of these elements fit together in order to provide a structured approach. And I use this today within the companies that I work with. I use this from a company perspective. I can use this from a divisional perspective. And I can also use this within a team perspective. All of it works. And the bit in the middle of what this will deliver then are high performing teams. And we do work with businesses to develop those high performing teams. So if we talk about each of those in a little bit more detail, which is what we're going to do, the plan that we have, the plan is what we talked about earlier. That is what sets the direction. That tells us the journey that we're trying to go on. The people that we have within that organization are what will enable that plan. And when we move on later and we talk about leadership development and training, it's so extremely important, because we can have the best plan in the world, but if we don't have the people trained and have the capability to deliver that plan, it's not going to happen. We talked about processes, but we have to make sure that the processes are driving the right direction. They're driving towards what we want the business to achieve. And we talk about performance metrics earlier. And these are the metrics that I say that tell us whether we're winning or losing. I've gone into businesses, and we'll talk about that again a little bit later on in certain case studies, where they're actually drowning in information. In fact, there's so much information they can't see the wood for the trees. So this is about actually being able to surface what are the right metrics. What's the most important number in the business that needs to be watched and managed? And then filter that down. What do we need for each team or each department underneath that? And how will their most important number then implicate and aid and drive towards what the company's most important number is? And then we need to make sure that the drivers of work, the activities of work that the people and the individuals do within those teams are done so in driving the business towards the right direction. So it's all about alignment. And finally, and not least, we have the structure which surrounds all of this. We need the structure right. And again, I've seen this where we have businesses that are just not structured properly to support where they are, and even to consider to support where they're going to. Too often the structure that exists within a business now today is possibly one that was set up 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or even longer. And so therefore that needs to be looked at and that needs to be questioned. And we need to consider that on the journey that we head into. I'm not sure if there's any F1 fans in the room. However, to bring this all back into the world of reality, as we sit at the weekend watching the Grand Prix, this very quick changeover, which is normally sub 2 seconds, is a great example of what I've just talked about. If we look at what has taken or what does take place to allow that to happen, and you think about what we've talked about, we've got the people. So the people within what we're looking at, we need to consider if they've got the right skills, have they got the right roles, have they got the right communication methods, have they got the right training, is there the right trust between each of the individuals? All of this has to exist within the people dimension. If we think about the plan that we talked about, what's the race strategy? Do you think that they have no race strategy? Absolutely not. They've got a very clear race strategy that everybody's bought into, and they all know what the implications are for them. And so therefore it's about making sure that that plan not only is developed, but understood. And if we think about the process, there's a very clear choreography, as I've talked about it here, which is the defined steps here. Who steps in, who steps out? What is the standard operating procedure for how to remove the nuts on a wheel? All of this is fine-tuned, and all of this then is measured with their health metrics, their measures of performance that let them know then whether all of this is taking them in the right direction or not. And if these metrics are indicating that that's not the case, then they need to go back and revisit what they're doing. So this is where I want you to get your pen and paper. And if you can see this image in the middle, can you try and replicate this on your piece of paper? Okay. And we're going to walk through each of what we've talked about. So allow from the center out, because we're going to score this from 0 to 10. And so if you, 0 being not good and 10 being excellent, but we'll talk about the scoring in a little minute. And if you draw this out, because eventually by the time we're finished, if you can see this green line in the middle, I would hope that by the time you're done, you will have something that will represent what you feel your business, your department, your team, whatever's applicable for you, and where you are at the moment. Okay? I'll give you 10 or 15 seconds to get that done. Now, as we move through this, I need you to be honest with yourselves. This is your own scoring for you to take away. Okay, let's go. So, how do we score it? Let's say anywhere between 1 and 3 is weak or unclear. So that is an area that is inconsistent, or maybe it's highly dependent on a few individuals if we're looking at the people pillar, for example. 4 to 6, we're saying then is a score where something is partially in place. We've got some good elements, but we're not consistently applying that, or it's not clearly owned or communicated. Then we talk about a scoring of around 7 to 8, which is strong, but it's not yet fully embedded within the business. And then we've got 9 to 10, which is clear and scalable. Okay, all happy with that? Okay. Now, one little thought before we jump into plan, because that's the first pillar now we're going to look at, and it's a proverb that I use when I'm delivering strategy with a business. And normally we would take a bit of time and unpack this, but the comment and the statement is: vision without action is a daydream, and action without a vision is a nightmare. So essentially, it's both sides of the coin. And that's something for us to consider as we move into questioning the plan or the strategy within the business. I tend to, I suppose you might wonder why I'm using the term plan. I find that if I use terminology like strategy, sometimes people can feel bamboozled by it to some extent, maybe overthink it, maybe feel they're not prepared to take part in something like talking about strategy. However, if we just talk about a plan, because that's ultimately what it's about. So we're going to score ourselves from a 1 to 10 on this, but I'm going to walk down some areas for you to consider before you arrive at your final score. So a plan is about a direction. Do we know what that direction is? Do you know what that direction is? Do you know what success is for you within your area or your business? We talk about current position or current state. Are you clear on where your current position is today, both financially and operationally? And this diagnostic is part of that. It's about actually starting to understand where you are at the moment. And then we bring that into our future ambition. Do we have a future plan or a vision? And where is that? And what is that? Because once we have that, what we then do is that we then start to bring that down into measurable activities. So if we want to be X in 3 years' time, what does that mean that we need to do now in the next 12 months? We boil that back right down into the priorities for now, and that gives us the direction for what we need to start working on. And priorities, as I said, that gives us the priorities of what we need to talk to. Sorry, I've jumped ahead. And decision making. And what do I mean by decision making? A plan of direction is very good in telling you what to do, but it's equally as important in telling you what not to do. Too often we get faced with numerous decisions and we don't know which ones we should and we shouldn't make. If we have that plan in place, that will guide us to the decisions as well that we shouldn't make. So a little bit of a case study as to where then that has been proof in practice. So we worked with a company called Grove Farms, and we eventually were able to identify and achieve 5 million in savings for Grove Farms. And how did we do that? Well, I've put this in under the pillar of plan because primarily the benefits that we achieved in that business was done through the alignment of the leadership team. There was a new leadership team that came into place, and so it was about getting them all onto the one page. It was about understanding what their shared future ambition was. And when we had that, we then were able to boil that back down into, well, what are the priorities that we need to address in the next 12 months? And we then created ownership and accountability for that. So before we step away from that, If you throw into chat, what are your scores for plan? What have you managed to mark yourselves on at the moment? Okay, we've got some high scores coming in. We've nines and sevens and sixes. That's very good. That's encouraging. Okay, hang on to that because we'll come back to those um, later on. So moving forward, we're going to look at structure. So we talked earlier about the importance of having a structure to secure and support the journey that the business is on. So some things to consider within this before we market for ourselves. Functional clarity. Are the key areas of the business clearly defined? So when we think about the structure of the business, we think about the areas that we need. So we begin to think about the finance department, we begin to think about the HR department, we begin to think about operations. We need to start thinking about what are the areas of support that we need within the business. Again, a good example of this is that we worked for a credit union, and it one of the changes that we made was actually setting up a department to train the cashiers because one of their pain points or bottlenecks were cashiers coming in and being trained on the desk. So when we thought about structuring the business differently, they had plenty of assets, as in locations. So we set up a location as a small training area, and so cashiers were trained for a number of weeks before they hit the cashier's desk. So that's an example of thinking about what the structural supports the business needs. Role clarity as well. Do people understand their role and what's expected of it? Because again, my experience would be no, that's not the case. Reporting lines. Do you actually know who your boss is? This seems like quite an obvious question, but again, quite often it's everything flows to, depending on the size of the business, it can be either everything flows through to the owner of the business or feeling that it will flow through to nobody because it's unclear. They're not sure. And we talk about communication. And when we talk about communication, we're talking about how we structure how communication takes place in the meeting, in the business, what meetings exist, what needs to exist. And then we think about supporting the growth as we've talked about. And finally, are the decisions made at the right level and escalated either up or downwards? So thinking about your own business and again scoring from 1 to 10, throw it into chat for me, where do you think that you would be? Okay. We seem to be coming out on average lower on this one. We're in around middle of the road. I would say five or sixes. So certainly not as strong as where we felt we were with the plan. So again, an example of where we used this was with a dairy co-op. It was quite a large business, turnover of about 400 million. But the big step change that we brought about within this business was the structure, how we structured the meetings, how we structured the communication, how we structured the work that we undertook, and how we identified those priorities and structured the accountability within the business. And that was the biggest impact that we had in that business. So we move on to people. And I use this slide when I'm talking to businesses. And actually, most business owners laugh at me and they go, well, actually, Philip, I would say it's probably about 99%. And so if you remember, we talked about the ecosystem and we talked about the importance of people. Out of my whole career, and if I look back on what I'm the most proud of, I would have to say it's actually the people development side of it. It's that actual development of a team or a person or an individual and seeing them grow and flourish. So before you begin to mark yourself, I want you to again think about these areas, skills and capability. Do your people do you remember our F1 team when we talked about them having all the skills needed and training to do their job? What do you think about your own? How do your people rate them in regards to their skill sets that they need? And then it's not only getting the job done, but it's actually the manner and how we get the job done. So the behaviors that we need in the business are very important. And the leadership strength. Are leaders leading by example? Are leaders supporting the firefighting that happens within the business? Ownership and accountability that we've talked about. Do people actually take accountability? We could even call it the culture of the business. I remember an old mentor of mine once saying the culture of a business is when somebody does something when you're not watching. That ultimately will be what defines the culture of the business. Are people motivated and are they clear in their expectations? If you remember earlier, we talked about what are the most important numbers for the business, for the team, for the individuals. Or is everybody clear in this for themselves? Again, I can see the scores coming in. Yous are all a step ahead of me, which is great. And it would seem that on average we're in around the same middle of the road. Five or sixes seems to be the average of what people are coming through with. So Gita Construction is a good example when we think about the people pillar. We've been working with Gita for a while, and we actually worked with Gita to do two things, I suppose, when looking at what we've talked about. We looked at the structure and we implemented a new associate director level as a structure change. And we then backed that up by a leadership training and development program for that level. And I'm actually now glad to say that a number of those associate directors have now since became directors as well within the business, which is great to see them succeeding. Okay, so you've given me your scores. On the process. So we're going to think about the process. So what are some of the considerations? Do we know what our key processes are and are they defined? I would imagine the answer is no. Quite often it isn't. How efficient are your processes? One of my bugbears as I moved through my corporate life was when you ask somebody, why do you do it that way? And the answer would inevitably be, well, Jimmy showed me that 10 years ago. Well, have you changed it since? No, 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 I'm still doing it the same way. And so it's back to as well that concept or mindset of continuous improvement. If we look for that 1% gain every day, then that will compound into a significant change for the business. But it's about actually having that mindset to think about how do we do this better? Is that process dependent on the person? Or could anybody from another team, another area come in and undertake that? Again, this is a struggle. Scalability. How does that process stand up if your business was to double? Is it future proof? Or do we need to look at doing something different to allow it to support the growth in the business? And experience. Does that process make life easier? Or does it create frustration? And finally, risk control. Are the processes documented? Again, not dependent on people. We want it to be process dependent, not people dependent. So, an example of this when we worked with a joinery business in the north of Ireland, and again, the process that they had from the estimating, quoting of jobs to how those jobs then were handed over to the production floor and how they were built out on the production floor was everybody was working in silos and everything was repeated again and again. And that actually generated significant savings for that business when we were able to align the processes and the systems inevitably that were used. And again, I working with a transport company at the moment, and the process again, I suppose the point I'm trying to make doesn't have to be a massive business end to end. It can be a process within a department. And we actually looked at and done a brown paper exercise on their invoicing process. And the owner of the business at one point after walking through this put her hands on her head and used the words and said, I'm embarrassed. Because when you can see the process mapped out, you can see the inefficiencies, you can see the frustration with people. The words were, I'm embarrassed. And it does exist in every business, I can guarantee you. It's only a case of being able to identify the one that will make the biggest difference for you because we can't do everything. So we want to be able to pick the ones that can make the biggest difference. So again, scores that came in there. Sorry, I missed them, Lee. I was talking, but on average, what would we seem to be there? We seem to be threes and fours. So that certainly seems to be on the lower end. And then performance. This is the area where we talked about how we make decisions in the business. Do we make the decisions in the business based on gut? I've been here 10 years, I've been here 20 years, I know the answer. Or is it actually based on fact? Okay, because I would often say that if we're not making the decision on fact, we're making up stories. So, some things to consider. Do you know what your most important numbers are in your business? Are they clearly defined? And do you review them regularly? If you produce metrics and you don't have the right environment in which they're discussed and action driven from them, too often they're useless, they're not leaned on, they're not used. Financial visibility, do you understand the margin and the profitability and the cash flow impact in your business? Can you see where your bottlenecks are in your operational or production process? What would slow it up if you, again, if I use that question of if you doubled, what would slow it up? And the review rhythm, are your reviews consistent? Do you know when to follow these up, how to follow these up? What do you talk about weekly, monthly, quarterly? And we can talk about leading and lagging indicators. So have we got both those indicators that indicate what may go wrong or what may go right? So we can break our measures down into those both sides as well. And then eventually we need to make sure the connectivity. Do we know that these numbers that we have, these metrics, are they connected to the plan that we talked about earlier? Because we don't want them to be separate metrics. We need these to be measuring the direction that we are heading towards delivering our ambition. So again, a little case study is where we worked with Greenview. This was with a private equity company who owned this business, and originally it was felt that there was a cash flow problem in the business, but actually it wasn't. The issue that we had in the business was that they weren't generating the profit to begin with, so it wasn't the management of the cash. Management of the cash was very good. It was the understanding of the profitability generation to begin with. And again, this is something I see too often. So we've got a bit of a spectrum there. We've got people coming in on the higher scale, and we've also got people coming in on the lower scale. So we have both. So you should now have a shape on your piece of paper, and your own shape will be unique to yourself. It'll be uneven, I would imagine. Um, if you're running at a 10 on everything, I would suggest you're maybe not being honest. And what you should look from this shape then is about an understanding of, you do need to know where you are strong and you need to protect those areas. I call them pockets of excellence. And so we need to make sure that we protect those areas. Once those areas are protected, we then need to look at the areas of where we're not so strong, and they're the areas that we need to grow. So some of the different areas that you may come up with, I'm going to pick two off this, for example. If anybody's prepared to share their own after I finish this, I would love to get your feedback. But let's say, for example, we've got top left here. We've got a business that scores high on plan and low on structure. So based on what we've talked about already, we know that we've got the vision, we've got the ambition, but what do we think the likelihood is of us delivering that plan? It's going to be fairly low, isn't it? And so therefore, that's why it's important that we then address the structure element. And I'm going to go down to the opposite end of that. I'm going to talk about high structure and low performance. So what we've got here is a business where the rules are clear, but the business lacks the measures. We don't know whether we're winning or losing, as I would call it. I use a comment of what's measured is managed. And if we're not measuring it, we're not going to manage it. And so even with this high structure, we're not going to know whether we're heading in the right direction within the business or not. Does that resonate with people? Has anybody got anything in particular they would like to share? We're all shy. Okay. I'm going to talk about the five whys quickly. Um, I'm going to do this because it's something I'm going to ask you to consider in the next question after this. So I'm not sure those that have come across the concept of five whys, but it was and is something that's taught within those businesses that have continuous improvement or Lean Six Sigma within it. But five whys is that concept of getting to the root cause of a problem. And so this is a simple little walkthrough where we diagnose the problem. We ran through a red light. So we say why? Well, because we were late for work. Yes, but why? Well, because we woke up late. Okay, but why? Because the alarm didn't work. But why? Because the battery was dead. But why? Because I forgot to check it. So the root cause of all of this was the fact that you forgot to check. Now, if we put that into a business context and we think about maybe our margin targets are missed, and we go, well, why were they missed? Well, because production didn't produce what it should have. It was delayed. Well, why? Well, because materials weren't available on the floor. But why? Well, because inventory, we didn't have visibility of inventory. We didn't know what we had. We didn't order it in time. But why? Well, because our system for tracking all of that is outdated. The data is not accurate, possibly. And so the root cause that we've got to here is the fact that our tracking system is not where it should be, and we don't have the visibility that we need to have. So it's a little concept. If you haven't heard of it, it's about getting to the root cause. So within your own business and what you've scored, what you've done here is step one. You've indicated where the gap is. What I want you to do for a minute is I want you to think about, well, what does that mean? What's the implications of that gap that you've now indicated? If your gap is low on people, what does that mean? I want you to write a couple of things down for yourself as to what that means for you. And when you've done that, I want you to think about then, which we're going to go into next, is what's it costing you? What's the impact in your business? Can you afford to delay in resolving that impact? So use the five whys, get to the root cause. Let's not deal with the symptoms. If we deal with the symptoms, we'll be constantly dealing with the symptoms. Whereas what we want to do is fix that root cause so that problem doesn't come back tomorrow. So thinking about the impact and quantifying that impact. When you're thinking about this, sorry, let me walk through this first of all. You could be thinking about the leadership hours, the time, and maybe go beyond the leadership hours. Maybe it's the team in your business, your payroll. How much hours are wasted? We talk about revenue leakage or revenue wastage. If something was fixed and you were able to get another 1% in sales, if you were able to get an improvement of 0.5% in your gross margin, if you were able to get your pricing fixed, what would be the impact? What would be what the business would achieve? Maybe something that you've indicated is impacting on a delay. Maybe because of the firefighting, you're not getting to deliver those projects that you need to deliver. Maybe decisions that need to be made are not being made. Or even what's the opportunity cost? If we spend so much time firefighting and we're not delivering the projects, is there a new product, a new service, a new idea that we should be going to market with that we don't have time for? So what's that opportunity cost for you? So I'll give you a little example. If I go back to that simple little example that I gave about the invoicing process, that process impacted upon the planning department and it impacted upon the admin department. And by the time we walked through that process, it was fairly clear that we were wasting probably 20% to 25% of the time across the individuals involved in that department. If you look at the salary bill for those two departments and you say 25% of that's been wasted, what is the impact for us? In that particular case, in just that one little process, that was indicating around 80,000. Now that 80,000 is a salary bill, which is black and white, and that's very quantifiable. There's still some unquantifiable elements that are taking place in the business that we can't put a value around. What are the opportunities that those people could have been working on that they are not? because they're tied up in activities that are wasting time and effort. So think about what the impact is for yourself. And remember that that impact is not a cost that you're incurring this year. It'll be incurring next year as well and the year after. But equally, if you save it and remove it, the benefit will compound in the same manner. So what we've done on the journey today is that we've touched on step one. We've looked at the audit of what's going on in the business, and that's on the journey towards delivering sustainable growth for a business. So how do we solve it? We use the Elevar business framework. We start with that diagnostic, and what we've been through today is a very light touch on that. We move into developing a strategy or a plan for the vision for the business. We build a leadership component. We look at the financial performance metrics across the business. We look at processes and systems alignment. Where are we efficient or inefficient? And we then look at governance that we run monthly to drive that level of accountability. What are the quantitative and qualitative impacts that we've seen to date? We've seen a rate of return of 4 to 1. We've seen performance growths of 15%, and we've seen savings of over $1 million. We can touch and feel that. But there are other elements that we've done and we've achieved that we can't quite touch and feel and with confidence put a figure around it, but it still happened. We've been able to improve culture and we've been able to improve retention. We've seen projects be identified and delivered more on time than ever. We've seen accountability grow and ownership in teams grow that we've worked with. So all of it has been very, very positive. So 3 things now that we all have that we didn't when we started. When I said an hour ago, we're not quite an hour ago yet, but we've now got clarity. You should have clarity on where your gaps are. Hopefully, if you don't have a number now, you will be able to work out a number on what it's costing you, and you'll have a decision on what the priority is of what you need to work with. So what we move into, and this is not a decision that, as I said, I need you to make now, but where this would lead to is the diagnostic which we would undertake. And that diagnostic is a fixed roadmap of what we do within a business. And we only work with a small number of clients. We're not a KPMG. We have a small team and we aim to work with only 4 companies a quarter. So if any of this is of interest to you, I would say give me a call. You've got my contact details and you can email me or you can ring me and we can set up a one-to-one alignment call where we can go through these details with you in together and go through your specific scores if you would like to have a conversation about them. No obligation. So it's 11:46. I've costed you 1 minute more than I promised. Thank you for your attendance. It was lovely to see you all here, and I will see you all again. Any questions, please do reach out. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Philip. That was great. Thank you. Talk
Bye,
to you
Angela.
soon.